All right, so we are on the last lecture video for pharmacy law. We're going to finish up the rest of the PowerPoint here. We are coming into the last week for pharmacy law, so don't forget that your pharmacy law projects are due next week. So you have to get those turned in via Blackboard. So we are picking up on slide 38, talking about the state boards of pharmacy. So there's no real consistency through the federal requirements for pharmacy practice, in particular to pharmacy technicians. So those restrictions on whether pharmacy technicians have to be certified or not, what their roles are, what their scope of practice is all dependent on and determined by each individual state board of pharmacy. So the state Board of Pharmacy provides recommendations for state pharmacy laws. So remember, a lot of those are different, and if there's a conflict between federal and state law, the pharmacy will always follow the more strict law. So for example, the perfect example is federal law allows dispensing of certain C5 oral solutions containing codeine over the counter in 4 ounces every 48 hours without a prescription. But in the state of Arizona particularly, they do not allow that. You still have to have a prescription for any of the codeine containing cough syrups. So certain states you can purchase that, but in the state of Arizona you can't. So practicing as a pharmacy technician in the state of Arizona, we follow the more strict law in this case, which would be Arizona state law. They review applications for licensure and registration. So every pharmacy is registered through the State Board of Pharmacy. Every pharmacist is registered, and then technicians depending on what their requirements are. The State Board of Pharmacy will license and register pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. They will inspect all new pharmacy sites in the state. They oversee the practice of pharmacy personnel. They oversee controlled and non-scheduled or non-controlled substances. And again, they define the scope of practice for pharmacy technicians. So in the state of Arizona, Arizona issues 2 types of licenses. So you must be licensed to work as a pharmacy technician in the state of Arizona. Right now, the first step that you've been applying for or have already gotten is your pharmacy trainee license. That is issued through the State Board of Pharmacy. You can work on that license in a pharmacy for 3 years. Once that 3-year expiration hits, you cannot work on it after that. So you have to become certified, which means you have to pass the PTCB exam to become a certified pharmacy technician. The sooner you do that, the better. There's a pay difference for trainees versus certified pharmacy technicians, and then also you have a more wide range of areas or pharmacies that you can work in compared to just being a trainee. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, ensures the safety and health of all U.S. workers. They regulate healthcare environments just like they do any other entity or any other work environments. In a hospital setting or a healthcare setting, they work to protect workers against inadvertent needle sticks, which is not so much a concern for pharmacists or pharmacy technicians, but obviously nursing staff, phlebotomists, and other healthcare professionals that do that type of care on patients. They ensure the safe disposal of syringes. Now, we are responsible for that as pharmacy technicians and pharmacists. If you're working in a hospital setting or any setting where you're doing any type of sterile compounding, if you're drawing up immunizations, if you're drawing up injections, anything like that, we have to dispose of those in the red biohazard containers. In a pharmacy setting or even a healthcare setting, OSHA also protects employees and healthcare workers against unnecessary exposure to drugs, and in particular hazardous drugs. The CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So we've heard a lot about the CDC lately over the last probably 2 months with our current situation that we're in with a pandemic for COVID-19. The CDC really grew out of an Army effort to fight malaria about a century ago. They're responsible for helping to fight infectious diseases, foodborne illnesses, and other threats to public health. You hear a lot, especially on the news right now, that companies and all of that are referring to CDC guidelines. That's just something that they're tracking. They're tracking all of the infectious diseases. They work closely with local and state public health departments, and they've, over this period of time, have probably been doing more work than they have in quite many years. They're very active during the cold and flu season in particular, but we kind of know the flu cycle. We know what to expect with the flu cycle, but now this COVID-19 is a whole new ball game. The CDC also publishes the guidelines on vaccinations, so they are the ones that set the vaccination requirements or recommendations for individuals of all ages, particularly the ones for children, established from birth on. They also established the recommended booster vaccines that we should get as adults, and then as we age, so things like the Pneumovax, vaccination for pneumonia, prevention, shingles, that type of thing. They also have the recommendations on the vaccines that you should get should you travel abroad to certain locations. There are some vaccinations that none of us may ever see in our entire lifetime, and that's because we haven't traveled abroad. Our military personnel have gotten most of these, especially if they're going overseas for any tours, and healthcare workers that volunteer in other countries, and stuff like that. But if you are planning to travel abroad, obviously not in the foreseeable future right now with what's going on, but eventually, hopefully, once we kind of get this under control and travel resumes, it's always best to check with your local health department to see if the area you're traveling to, if there's any recommended vaccines that you get prior to that travel, and they recommend getting that about 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks prior to travel, just so your body has enough time to build up the antibodies for it. State departments and boards of health. So each state has a board which oversees public health. Again, you've heard a lot, especially here, Pima County Health Department. They may establish their own regulations for infectious diseases, emergency situations, and other health issues. It does seem like most of the local public health departments, the state health departments, are all kind of working together and following, recommendations coming from the federal government and the CDC. They may enlist the help of pharmacies during state epidemics or public health threats. So, for example, if we had a cure or a medication that has been identified to actively treat COVID-19, they would be working closely with the pharmacies in each jurisdiction, each town, each city, each state, to make sure there was enough medication for everybody to get their hands on it. Joint Commission. So the Joint Commission is used to be known, or it's called the Joint Commission. It used to be known or used to be called the Joint Commission on Accreditation for Healthcare. It is a non-governmental, non-profit organization that specifies standards of care in hospitals and healthcare facilities. So their focus is standard of care and also quality of care. So patient safety overall and quality of care that they receive. So accreditation by the Joint Commission is basically the healthcare equivalent of the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. It is a voluntary accreditation. However, most insurance companies and especially government agencies like CMS, so Centers for Medicaid Services, Medicaid, Medicare Services, they require facilities to be accredited through Joint Commission. So what that means is if a hospital or a clinic wants to accept patients that have Medicare or Medicaid, or what we call Access in Arizona insurance, and receive reimbursement for those patients, the facility must be accredited by Joint Commission. Excuse me. The United States Pharmacopeia Convention, known as the USP. So the USPNF is a key pharmacy resource. It sets the standards regarding the practice of pharmacy by pharmacists and technicians. So again, these are the ones that set those chapters. USP Chapter 795 addresses non-sterile compounding procedures, standards. The USP Chapter 797 addresses sterile compounding policies and procedures and also standards. And then you have the USP 800, which is specific to hazardous drugs and hazardous compounding. The standards are adopted by the state boards of pharmacy and also the Joint Commission. So again, Joint Commission has its own set of standards. It has adopted what those requirements or what those standards are recommended from the USP, and the state board has as well. So it's pretty much a working and uniform all together for all three across the board, and ultimately making sure that not only are we providing safe work environment for healthcare staff, but also that our patients are not only receiving safe care, but a quality of care as well. Legal duties for pharmacy technicians. So legal duties are not defined by a federal statute, which means there's no uniform federal law that says pharmacy technicians have to have education, pharmacy technicians have to be certified. In fact, there still are a few small amount of states that are holding out and do not require pharmacy technicians to be certified. The changes to the Pharmacy Technician Certification Board are known as the PTCB, which is a professional organization for us. They are the one that issues our exam to allow us to become certified. They made changes to their requirements starting January 1st, 2020, that requires anyone who wants to sit for the exam to become a certified technician needs to go through a accredited program, which is what PMI is. We are an accredited program, or the pharmacy technician is an accredited pharmacy technician program. So those of us that have been pharmacy technicians for any period of time, I've been a pharmacy technician for a very, very long time. This was exciting for us because it's starting to set the standard of the requirement of the foundation that you need of knowledge to work as a pharmacy technician. Next week, you're going to view or listen to a podcast on the Emily Jerry story, and this is one of the main reasons why pharmacy technicians should not only be required to go through schooling, but also be required to be certified. Pharmacy duties change as the roles of the pharmacist change. So we take on more roles and responsibilities as the pharmacists are given more roles and responsibilities. One thing that they're starting to do in certain states, Arizona is not one of them just yet, but that is coming down the pipeline eventually in the next couple years probably, is that in some states they're also now starting to allow pharmacy technicians to actually administer vaccines. So that's something that's inevitable, that's going to start spreading across the states because the pharmacists are starting to continue to evolve into a more clinical role, that they're taking some of those physical duties away from them and giving those to the pharmacy technician. Again, you can't just have someone walking in off the street wanting to work as a pharmacy technician and expect them to know how to give an immunization. I wouldn't want to get that shot. State-specific regulations are available at your State Board of Pharmacy website. So if you ever have a question, or let's say you move to another state and you need to figure out how you can work as a pharmacy technician, going to their State Board of Pharmacy website or calling them is the first thing that you need to do. As pharmacy technicians shift into greater roles of responsibility, the elements of liability also shift with them. So in pharmacy-related court cases, typically a government prosecutor will bring the case against the suspected party, which is usually often the pharmacist. And the reason for that is because we as technicians are working underneath the pharmacist license. So if I were to make a huge error and I caused a patient's death, I may not be prosecuted, but the pharmacist may, because I'm working under his license. Okay. State Board of Pharmacy reviews such cases before they go to court. Lesser cases are settled out of court and handled by each individual State Board of Pharmacy. The State Board can also ask for a criminal investigation. This is typical if harm was intentionally done to a patient, or there's been some sort of drug diversion or controlled substance theft. That's what will typically require a criminal investigation, and those usually go to court. The defendant may be tried in criminal court and civil court for the different aspects of the same case. So criminal court, if there is any suspected criminal charges that should be brought against the individuals. And then civil court, if it's a patient that's been affected, the patient and or family members could sue. So on slide 47, it actually gives you some examples from the California State Board of Pharmacy on some examples of what their disciplinary actions are for certain things. Personal misuse of drugs or alcohol, especially on the job, improper possession of controlled substances, stealing those controlled substances from your facility, selling them on the streets, any other fraudulent acts like that. In the state of California is an immediate revocation of their license, along with options to gain those back. They may require the individual to do any type of drug rehabilitation, mental health counseling, and it carries a minimum 90-day suspension with a 3 to 5 year probation added on top of that. You do get publicly reprimanded. If you actually go to any of the state boards of pharmacy, you can look up their cases by name. You can search individuals and see who pharmacists, technicians have had any type of dings against their license per se, and it'll tell you exactly all the details of the court or the meeting that was held with the State Board of Pharmacy. So if you want to save yourself some of that embarrassment, stay out of trouble. So also in those cases, typically there's a pretty large fee or fine for any type of that activity. So if another offense, an emergency refill without prescriber authority, improper substitution of a generic drug, or dispensing in an incorrectly labeled container. In California, this comes with 1 year probation with optional terms that can be added. So they can look at the situation, what happened, and determine if there's any other stipulations or requirements that the staff must do, the individual who's involved must do, and they may extend the probationary period. Unlawful possession of or disposal of a needle or syringe, unprofessional conduct. In the state of California, that carries a 3 year probation. Civil laws are areas of the law that concern the wrongdoings that citizens commit against one another. Torts refer to personal injuries. The injured party is the plaintiff. Whoever caused the injury is the defendant. So examples of this would be negligence, malpractice, or any type of broken contracts. And ultimately the burden of proof falls on the plaintiff or the injured individual. Negligence is a failure to provide the minimum reasonable actions to prevent harm, which results in harm. Malpractice, which is a form of negligence, is the failure to meet an ordinary professional standard of care resulting in injury, loss, or damage. Standard of care, which is key to both negligence and malpractice, is a level of care expected to be provided by the various healthcare providers in the local community. So we are all set by a level of standard of care. 2 criteria to consider when judging care is if it's provided to a patient. So the level of professional training. So I am not going to perform any physical therapy on a patient because I am not a physical therapist, right? And then also depending on the geographic area. So Generally, technicians are not brought to court because the actions done within their job description, since they are under the pharmacist's approval. However, as technicians grow more educated, trained, and certified and are given greater responsibilities, they will also begin to grow more liability. So that's one thing that's always kind of been a complaint from pharmacists, which, I get. Is that they're the ones held responsible for our actions right now. And that's just the way the laws have always been set up, that we work underneath the pharmacist license. They're essentially supposed to be watching and supervising what we're doing, and they have the final check of the prescription. So, but as our roles begin to evolve and we are starting to be recognized as an educated need field, we can start to be held liable on our own. So how the standard of care applies to pharmacy technicians. So again, conduct compared to that of a pharmacy technician in the same geographic area. Certified technicians are held to a higher standard than one who is not certified. And that is because when a certified pharmacy technician has gone through to pass the certification and versus someone who has not. In negligence or malpractice lawsuits, they watch for the 4 Ds. So duty, which is to provide care, was established between the parties. Dereliction, the defendant was remiss or lax in his or her duty. Damages were done to the plaintiff. And direct cause is established linking the defendant's dereliction to the damages done. If the defendant is found guilty, he or she may be ordered to pay an award of money to the plaintiff, and in some cases they may be sentenced to jail time. The law of agency and contracts applies to the employee-employer relationship. So the employee is an agent of an employer and may enter into contracts or personal activities on the employer's behalf. The pharmacy technician acts as an agent for a pharmacist or a pharmacy. So ultimately, at the end of the day, wherever you're working, right, you are not only a representation of yourself, but you are also a representation of your company. How the law and agency contracts apply to pharmacy techs. So the pharmacist and the technician are obligated to provide a pharmacy service. The technician agrees to fill the patient's prescriptions. If a mistake is made, the pharmacist or the pharmacy are liable. The pharmacist answers for all the acts of his or her assistants, which is pharmacy technicians, and a lot of that comes with heavy personal fines and can even lead to jail time or immediate termination of employment. The technician is liable if the prescription is dispensed without a pharmacist's check and approval. So let's say you handed over a prescription to a patient that came to pick it up and it was not checked, had not been through the final check or final verification from the pharmacist, you were actually liable for that. That is your responsibility to make sure that has been done. Invasion of privacy may result in lawsuits. So here we are with HIPAA. Okay, you can be held individually responsible for HIPAA violations. So intellectual property contained in the medical records is the property of the patient. Protected health information, or PHI, may not be shared without consent from the patient. I don't care if it's the spouse. If they have not signed that sheet that allows us to share that with their spouse, we cannot do it, no matter how much they yell and scream and curse at us, how much they cry and beg us. Do not do it. The pharmacy is held responsible for the actions of its personnel if a violation occurs. So the pharmacy will be held responsible, which the company is not going to be very happy with you. You probably will lose your job, and you can still have charges brought against you as an individual. And we have made it all the way through Chapter 2. If you have any questions, be sure to give me a call, send me an email. I will be happy to help.